We are embarrassed to have big, unruly somethings and would much rather go with the flow and have a normal life like everyone else. Not at 30 or even 20 years old. We begin thinking this way at 11 or 12. So what do you do when you find yourself buying the nothing lie? You read this chapter and everything will be magically fixed. I wish that were the case. But you usually can't just eject a soundtrack of doubt or denial that's been playing for years. What you can do, and it's really the best place to start, is call the soundtrack what it really is, a lie. You might still hear it. You might put this book down and hear it louder than ever before. But a lie is still a lie. And a lie is no foundation on which to base your career decisions. Don't buy into the nothing lie. You wound yourself when someone compliments your gift and you reply, "Oh, that's nothing." Your gift is never nothing. Regardless of what it can be, it is always something. And something is the perfect place to start. There is a deep, deep hope seated in the idea that finding a dream is an act of recovery. There is a huge worth the price of this entire book difference between trying to discover your something and trying to recover your something. When you ask the question, what do I want to do with my life? You should feel at least a little overwhelmed. There are a million possible answers to that question. Where do you begin? A sport I'm pretty good at? A hobby? A city where I'd like to live? Should I take a cooking class or a tango class? Should I go back to school and get a degree? Or just grow a really great garden? Of all the countless paths I could take, which one leads me home? It's exhausting. The question, what do I want to do with my life, is nearly impossible to answer confidently and concisely, and that's because it's a discovery question. You're really asking, how do I discover what I want to do with my life? That is a question that points you into the vast expanse of the entire universe for an answer. It might sound fun, but once you're there, it can quickly swallow you up. But if finding your dream is an act of recovery, that changes everything. You don't ask the bottomless, what do I want to do with my life? But instead, what have I done in my life that I love doing? Instead of a million different options from out there, you're suddenly left with a manageable handful of options from within your own experience. Instead of trying to hitch your star to an endless black hole of options, you hitch a ride on your rewarding past. Once you make this mental switch, you can immediately start combing through your history for hints that will reveal your something. My favorite way to do this is by looking for hinge moments. In search of the hinge. Mercedes-Benz had a problem. They had developed an incredibly expensive sports car. It was an SLR and it cost more than $400,000, or as I like to think of it, double my first house. Although the production run of this particular beast was fairly limited, they still wanted to make sure each one sold. In order to do that, every inch of the car needed to scream high-end performance. Every detail had to be perfectly matched to the power and luxury the car offered drivers. The engine had to be extraordinary. The doors needed to be gateways to an adventure, not just a matter of ingress into a car. The ignition had to be igniting. When you think about it, the way we start our cars has not changed all that dramatically over the years. Once we moved beyond the arm-breaking cranks that were on the grills of Model Ts, little progress happened to the actual ignition. Miles per gallon, aerodynamics, heated seats and automatic doors. Almost every part of the car has gone through a revolution of design improvement, except for the ignition. It has essentially remained the same for decades. You put a key in, you turn it, the car turns on, you drive. But if the car in question is the Mercedes-Benz SLR, a standard ignition will not suffice. You can't go ordinary in an extraordinary vehicle. So Mercedes looked at some improvements that have been made in the last 20 years. Some drivers seem to really enjoy push-button ignitions. There's something inherently fun about pushing a button to start your car. But it's also fairly common at this point. You can get a push-button ignition in a Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord. It's not that special anymore. The first thing Mercedes did is relocate the ignition button. While other manufacturers tended to place it in the dashboard, Mercedes put it in the gear stick. Right away, that feels a little different. Now starting your car feels a little like turning on a video game. That's interesting, and a good start, but this is a $400,000 car. We have to move way beyond interesting. What Mercedes-Benz did next forever changed the way I look at my life. That is a big statement, but I assure you it is not an exaggeration. It literally rewired how I look at what it means to follow a dream and do the things you love in life. It turned my understanding of what it takes to recover what you want to do upside down. What did Mercedes-Benz do to the ignition button? They added a hinge. On top of the button, they put a small hinge that held a cover in place. In order to start the car, you had to first open the cover and then press down on the ignition button with your thumb. That simple hinge tapped into every scene in every movie where someone launches a missile. The Hunt for Red October, Crimson Tide, Top Gun, in any scene where the hero is about to launch an attack to vanquish a seemingly impossible foe, he must first open the cover and engage the hinge. Suddenly, with a simple hinge, Mercedes-Benz forever altered the experience of its car. When you got into the SLR, you weren't starting a car. You were launching a missile out of your garage. With an incredibly simple hinge, Mercedes imbued their vehicle with an undeniable amount of emotion and energy. I knew they understood what they had done when I saw their brochure for the SLR. It was only a few pages long, so they were only able to put photos and information about the most critical elements in it. On one page was a photo and explanation of the engine. It probably took years and millions of dollars to develop. On the other page, Mercedes put a close-up of the hinge. It probably cost $30. It might have only taken a few days to come to the conclusion to add it to the car. It was incredibly small and insignificant when taken out of context. But none of that mattered. None of that made a difference because the hinge was the most important part of that vehicle. Sometimes we think we need a massive eureka moment to come to grips with who we want to be and what we want to do. We wait for the lightning strike that will completely redefine our lives and give us clear direction. But the truth is, the greatest impact tends to come from hinge moments. A hinge moment occurs when you're planning to do something standard and normal, something you've done many times before, like turn a key in the ignition. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, something, a small detail usually, hinges you in a different direction. A chance encounter at the grocery store, a stranger's random comment, one line in an article you read pushes you to a place you are not expecting to go. Two such occurrences come to mind from my own life. Mrs. Harris and my first book. When people ask me when I knew I wanted to be a writer, this is the moment to which I most consistently point back. While living in Ipswich, Massachusetts, my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Harris, challenged me to write a book. I'm not sure why, since the class was not writing books at the time. But regardless of the reason, she tasked me with writing a book, and that's exactly what I did. After school each afternoon, I wrote poetry on those brownish sheets of paper with the red and blue lines and mile-wide margins. The poems weren't great. I remember rhyming fall and tall an awful lot. We didn't sell any copies. I didn't walk away with a lightning strike moment in those cold New England afternoons spent dulling my pencil. But it felt true. Even at that age, it felt like something I really liked doing and something I just assumed everyone else liked to do. There's a natural feeling to the things we're called to that we often assume everyone else has. Nothing dramatic happened with that book, except Mrs. Harris did a few things with it. She laminated it. She bound it. She made me feel like I was a published author. That was monumental for me. She didn't tell me I was an author. Those words never left her mouth. She didn't write that on a note in the book. She simply put the book together and handed it to me. Suddenly, I was an author. The lamination sealed it, literally and metaphorically. It meant the world to me, and though I couldn't tell you about anything I wrote for the next 5 years, that was a flare sent up high in the sky of my childhood. That was the very first hinge moment when I can remember where I thought writing might be something I could do forever. My dad gets the mail. My dad never got the mail when I was a kid. Well, almost never. Because as a pastor who was trying to raise boys carefully, he had some sort of sixth sense when it came to the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. He could go a full 11 months and 29 days without getting the mail. But then on swimsuit issue day, he flashed on the scene like a phantom, grabbed the thing, and threw it in the trash before my brothers and I knew what had happened. That was one of the 2 times he got the mail. The other was my second hinge moment. We didn't talk about it at the time. We haven't talked about it in the last 20 years. But when I was a teenager, he did something that spoke again to that third grader who liked to write about trees. One night, he grabbed the mail and found me downstairs. He handed me a thick packet with a brown envelope attached. Unbeknownst to me, he'd sent away for a special kit on how to publish a book. I don't know if he paid for it or if it was just one of those things you could get for free because they wanted to sell you something. It didn't matter. Here was a thick, "You are important to me, you could be a writer if you wanted to be" packet. I think he might have spoken 3 or 4 sentences about it, and then we never discussed it again. I opened it and was excited, but ultimately never followed through on it. I was a girl-obsessed, awkward teenage boy, and writing a book seemed difficult and time-consuming. But that moment was part of the fuel that made me feel like my first book was in fact possible. That moment was forever etched in my memory as something that supported my belief that I could actually do this thing called writing. My dad believed in me. My dad believed in me so much that he had a packet for professional writers sent to me. That was my second Hinge moment, and I can still speak about it like it happened yesterday. A few questions to ask when interviewing Hinge moments. Looking back on it, the Mrs. Harris poetry book in the 3rd grade was a bit like a Hallmark movie of the week. There I was, living on the North Shore, Massachusetts, in a town that literally had a castle on the coast. My father was in seminary and painting houses to make ends meet. We didn't have a lot, but I did have my poetry, and that kept me warm on those New England winter nights when the dark seemed hungry and the snow merciless. That's a bit much, but the truth is that Hinge was not difficult to spot. Looking back on it, the idea that a teacher would tell you she thought you were talented and actually use her free time to put together your first book is a standout moment. But not all Hinges are that neon. Most of the time, I think they're a bit harder to recover. They're buried sometimes, and you have to unearth them. I thought just now about suggesting an egg drawing technique I once learned about, but the more I wrote about it, the more I felt like you should be lying down on a couch, and I should have a counselor's beard simply saying, yes, please go on. So instead of asking you to color with crayons or unpack your issues, I think we can identify some of your Hinge moments by knowing the right questions to ask. Questions I found helpful when figuring out my own Hinge moments. Number 1, what do I love enough to do for free? That's a cliche you sometimes hear in guidance counselors' offices in high school, but it's no less true. What would you do even if no one paid you for it? I blogged for about 2 years and didn't make a dime. I didn't need to. I wasn't writing for money. I was writing because I am a writer, and that's what writers do. Number 2, what do I do that causes time to feel different? When you really get engaged in your something, space and time seem to shift a little. You'll sit down to do a little writing before dinner, and the next time you look up, it's 10 and you never ate. Time shifts when you're doing what you love. Has that ever happened? And if so, what were you doing? Number 3, what do I enjoy doing regardless of the opinions of other people? Your dream can't be powered by opinion or affirmation. It has to be bigger than the feedback of a peer or a coworker. What would you do even if no one told you they loved it? Number 4, if only your life changed, would that be enough? If you killed yourself for years creating something and at the end of the experience, the only life that had changed was your own, would that be rewarding enough? If the experience was the lesson and the journey itself was the reward, would that be okay with you? Is there something that holds that sway for you? Number 5, are there any patterns in the things you like doing? If you've got a dream, chances are there's not just one isolated Hinge moment in your past. More than likely, you have a list of moments that are similar and related. What patterns can you see in the decisions you've made and the experiences you've loved? Ask yourself those questions. Love yourself enough to actually write down your answers. And when you do, show them to someone you trust. Sometimes we're so close to the painting, we can't tell what it is, and we need someone else to point out the truth. There is a word of caution about the 2 Hinge moments I gave as examples. Those were both happy examples, times when someone reinforced what felt like a dream I had inside of me, or when someone complimented a natural talent I thought I possessed. But don't confuse a Hinge moment with a happy moment. Some of my most pivotal Hinge moments were not particularly happy moments. They were discouraging moments that didn't create a rainbow path for me to follow, but instead clarified that a particular path was by no means going to work out for me. Like that afternoon I spent in a real advertising agency. I didn't cry when I got back to the car with my mother-in-law, but it was only because I didn't want to miss my flight. Plus, when flying out of Atlanta, it's always best to save your tears for the airport. It will break you. It's a mashup of Mad Max's Thunderdome and overbooked flights that run on ish time. As in, you'll fly out at 4-ish. Or, your plane isn't here yet, but should be soon-ish. But that day, I had another reason to get teary. Prior to getting in the car with my mother-in-law, I had spent 2 hours inside an advertising agency trying to get a job. My wife and I lived outside of Boston in Arlington, Massachusetts, but we wanted to move to Georgia. We'd had our first daughter, the snow was killing my Floridian wife, and it was time to move closer to family. But I couldn't find a job. On my first flight down to have breakfast with a friend's contact, the person I met with refused to accept a copy of my resume. The entire purpose of the trip was to meet this person, and in our unexpectedly terse breakfast meeting, he said, "I don't know anyone in Atlanta in advertising, and no, I don't want a copy of your resume." That meeting was not particularly awesome, but he actually did know someone in Atlanta in advertising. His relative worked at an ad agency, and over a period of weeks, I arranged a meeting with her. I spent days and days putting together my portfolio, a copywriter's toolkit to showcase the best work they've done. At the time, I thought working at an ad agency was my dream. I was really proud of the work I had already accomplished at a small advertising agency and in the marketing departments of corporations I had worked for. I showed up bright and early at the meeting in a shirt from the look fancy part of my closet. This wasn't an interview, though. Nobody in Atlanta would see me for an interview. I spent that day driving around Atlanta with my mother-in-law, who lived there, dropping off resumes and mini portfolios at any agency I could find. I researched the names of a dozen creative directors in the city. Then I would walk into advertising agencies and ask the receptionist to, "Please give this to Bill Smith." So although I had flown down for the sole purpose of meeting this contact at an ad agency, this was not something formal or promising. I was desperate at this point and greatly appreciated the 20 casual minutes she gave me talking about what it was like to work in advertising in Atlanta. On the way out, she walked me by someone's office and said, "You should meet Mark." Turns out Mark was an Atlanta advertising expert. In addition to working at the biggest agencies in town, he taught at the Creative Circus, a 2-year advertising master's program. Mark invited me into his office, and we ended up talking for an hour. He asked to see my portfolio, the one I had killed myself to put together. I thought, here comes my big break. By page 2, he was shaking his head in disappointment. I don't remember if he even finished looking at the entire thing because my head started to spin and I thought I was going to throw up. What I do remember is that he took out 2 other portfolios, a good one and a bad one. He showed me what a copywriter's portfolio should look like, and it was nothing like mine. I wasn't even close to his bad example. 6 years into my career and my portfolio was pitiful. At that point, I just wanted to roll out a smoke bomb, slide to the floor, and crawl for the parking lot where my mother-in-law was waiting patiently. But the experience wasn't over. Mark called the admin in and asked for the box of portfolios from people who had submitted them to this agency in hopes of getting a job. It was the size of a coffin for a pony. He then said, "Sit at an empty desk and go through these. See what you can learn." In the middle of an office I'd never been in, without cubicle walls, I sat at someone's seat who was out to lunch and started leafing through dozens of portfolios from people who were better than me. It was meant as a lesson, and Mark was incredibly kind to me that day, but it was an immensely discouraging experience. Looking back on it now, I can see how hinge moments like that and a few others changed my focus from advertising. I didn't want to be in advertising. I didn't want to be one more portfolio kept in one more box in the dust under one more assistant's desk. Removing advertising from my dream, coming up against that hard wall, subtracting that option from the list of things I was dreaming about, helped me focus on what I really loved. I didn't love advertising. I got all the wrong answers when I asked advertising my hinge moment questions. I loved insight and writing. Advertising was just an execution of insight. The core of what I loved to do was insight. And that hinge moment, though painful and shared with my mother-in-law, swung me closer to pursuing what I loved. For some of us, Recognizing the hinge moments isn't the most difficult part. We've dreamed about our something for years. We're familiar with the 30,000-foot view. It's seeing things at 10,000 feet, and then 10 feet, and then from the ground. That's so difficult. That's when the obstacles really show up. Anyone can dream. It's the doing that is such a hassle. Chapter 3. What lies between a day job and a dream job. You didn't have to be Scooby-Doo to figure out something was wrong with the house we were trying to buy in Tennessee. The Property Disclosure Agreement, a legally binding document, indicated that there were 0 repairs made to the house in the entire time the owner lived there. We wanted to believe that. We did. We thought the house was charming. The neighborhood was adorable. When it was Halloween, they had a big block party. At Christmas, a decorating contest with official prizes. When it snowed, they held a snowman contest. Bluebirds would land on your shoulder when you walked to the mailbox and sing you a jaunty tune. But something was decidedly wrong with the house. How did we come to this conclusion? The owner had written notes in Sharpie on the attic rafters, indicating to repairmen where all the roof leaks were. But maybe we were just being fancy. It's just the roof. Fair enough. But then we got in the crawl space and found buckets collecting water. How could they have possibly left buckets to collect water and at the same time told us the house was in perfect shape? But who doesn't like water, right? It's life-giving. It's awesome. Maybe we could overlook that. We tried to, I promise. But the final straw, or rather the final 98 strawed straw, was the 98-point home inspection list we received. If you've never bought a house, those weren't 98 compliments the home inspector made. Those were 98 things that needed fixing, ranging from minor repair to this house will steal your soul. The smart thing to do would have been to walk, no run, away from this particular house. My father-in-law is a home builder. My mother-in-law is a home builder. My wife has her master's in construction management and used to be a real estate agent. We are not dumb when it comes to homes. And when I say we, I mean they. But we still had a hard time walking away from what appeared to be a money pit. The reason is that we are getting slammed by one of the costs of chasing our dream. Risk. Every dream has risk associated with it. Some might have more than others, but each dream comes wrapped in some degree of risk. If it doesn't, it's not really a dream. The one risk we were facing in this exact moment surrounded our finances. By accepting my dream job and joining the Dave Ramsey team, my salary had decreased. Over time, there was a great potential to make great money, but for the first year or so, things are going to be in a bit of a flux. For the first 6 months, I'd have a steady base salary, but after that, the salary would decrease and our life would be funded in part by the commissions I made. We didn't love that leaky-roofed house, but we were afraid that if we waited too long to buy one, we wouldn't be able to get a good loan. It was easier to secure a loan when I had the first 6 months of salary to show versus the flip-flop, inconsistent world of commissions. I might believe that I'd make dramatically more in the second 6 months of my first year, but the bank wouldn't believe that. So we started to panic and thought, we better lock in this loan, buy this house while we can, because if we wait, we'll never get a good loan. The entire logic of that fear is messed up, but fear is rarely logical. Locking in a loan we might not be able to afford would have been an incredibly stupid thing to do and against everything the company I work for believes. Buying a house with a faulty roof, water in the crawl space, and 98 other problems would have been a foolish thing to do. But when the risks of chasing a dream show up and we allow fear to ride in on their coattails, we often make some really horrible decisions. And it all starts with how we decide to look at risk. The magnifying glass, the kaleidoscope, and the telescope. Risks are coming. In the next chapter, we'll talk about some significant ways to mitigate them. But it doesn't make sense to pretend you won't face any. You will. How you perceive them will largely determine how successful you are at overcoming them. In general, there are 3 different ways we look at risks associated with a dream. Number 1, the magnifying glass. Sometimes, when we're afraid of a risk, we look at it through a magnifying glass. We stare intently at it, blowing the possible consequences way out of proportion. We stare so closely at the risk that it fills our entire field of vision. We lose all sight of the possible reward a dream offers. We allow the risk to dominate the dream and define the future. If we failed in the past, we start magnifying that experience too. We do not say, I failed. We say, I am a failure. Friends and family members will try to show us all the things we've lost sight of, but we will not hear it. They don't have the same magnifying glass we do. Number 2, the kaleidoscope. The best definition of creativity I ever heard from someone was that it is a wild mind with a disciplined eye. A highly creative person has the ability to feed his mind all these different topics and ideas, then see a connection between previously unconnected things in a way no one has ever seen before. That definition is what makes the kaleidoscope view of risk so difficult for creative people. With this perspective, you look at your risk as if you're peering through a kaleidoscope tube. Instead of brightly colored jewels or mirrors that scramble the image you see, you add in parts of your life. The risk of your dream is no longer a risk that impacts 1 or 2 areas of your life, your career and your finances. It is now connected to every other aspect of your life. For instance, in our house situation, when I looked through the kaleidoscope, here's what I saw. This house looks like it has a lot of issues, but if we don't buy it, we'll never be able to get a loan. And if we can't get a loan, we'll have to rent somewhere else. Ellie will eventually have to go to her 4th school in 4 years. Our kids won't be able to walk to school. They'll probably hate a different school and get picked on. They'll be so sad we left Atlanta. The stress of constantly getting rejected from loan offers will probably be a lot of strain on my wife. And in order to find a place we can rent, we'll have to move 30 minutes away from her community of friends. We'll never be able to replace those friends, and we'll probably end up homeless and friendless, and I'll have to grow a patchy beard because I can't afford razors. The end. It's ridiculous, I know. But if you've ever looked through a kaleidoscope, you know that what you see is never what's really there. The same thing happens when you look at risk in this way. Your fears and your worries are jumbled and multiplied 1,000 times over until you lose sight of what is really before you. Number 3, the telescope. When my daughters were young, they used to be horrible at hide and seek. Like most kids, they believed if they couldn't see you, you couldn't see them. So instead of hiding, they would just close their eyes and stand completely still. We often do that same thing with risk, but it's still there. And if we ignore it, we can't plan for it, prepare for it, or protect ourselves from it. That's why the telescope method is my favorite approach. Telescopes are designed to view things that are far away, and that's where most of our risks are too. They haven't happened yet. They're in the future, and they live in the land of what if. When you look at a risk through a telescope, you're able to create a safe distance between your dream and your fears. You can see the risk in detail, but you acknowledge that a lot can happen in the space between you and that risk becoming reality. You acknowledge it's there. You can see it, but you're not allowing it to dominate your decisions. It's just one possible outcome. And by seeing it a long way out, you can make plans to reduce your chances of arriving at that outcome. We'll talk more about a specific way to create a telescope